Hello, everyone, and welcome to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning, a Child Nexus podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wilson. I'm excited that you're here with me today and excited because it is May, which means that we are approaching the end of the school year. And today we're going to delve into practical advice for parents to help their kids finish the year strong. We're also going to discuss considerations for using summer break effectively to catch up or enhance learning. My guest today is Hunja Koimburi from Hayuten Education. Hunja brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in educational therapy, specifically tailored to meet the needs of students with learning differences. At Hayuten Education, Hunja works closely with families and educators to develop personalized strategies that enhance learning outcomes. Join me in welcoming Hunja to the podcast.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hunja, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's so great running into you. It's like we did the summit together for college transition, and then we met at the luncheon a couple of weeks ago, and now you're doing this, and I'm so excited to be able to work with you again.
Yes, it really is. It's really a pleasure and an honor. I was very excited that you asked me. Like you said, it's so many fun chance meetings with the summit and the luncheon, and then here, like all in the space of like maybe a month.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you spoke at the summit about students who were transitioning to college. We had focused on students with learning and thinking differences. And then I was thinking it would be great to have you come back and talk about, this end of the school year. We're right in the throes of the end of the academic year. Things are wrapping up. Students are thinking about what are they going to do for summer. And as we approach the end of the school year, talking about some key strategies for parents that they can use with their children and teens, especially those with learning differences. So I'm excited about having that conversation. But, you work with students who think and learn differently. I would love for you to begin by talking about, what drew you to specialize with students with learning differences, and then we can jump into the conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I've been thinking about that because a number of people ask me how I got into this particular role, and I always have to think back. I think in some ways it was a part of a passion, but some of it was almost by accident. I've always enjoyed teaching, always loved it. So all through college, I was a peer tutor, absolutely loved it. And something that I think I found, I also enjoy public speaking quite a bit. And I think I've realized it's more so because not so much that I enjoy the speaking piece, but I enjoy being able to take a concept and help someone understand a little bit more about it. But I did that through college. I studied economics and economics and law, and I thought that was where I'd sort of go into in terms of my career, profession, to be in those specific fields. But I sort of fell into it by accident. So when I got to Los Angeles with my family, as I was looking for different jobs, nothing was coming up in my particular fields of study. So I worked at a Starbucks, I worked at a container store, which I loved. And then I started working at Linda Mood Bell, which is an organization which focuses a lot on students with learning differences. And so that piqued my interest. And now I've been at Hayton for about 3 years. So now in my role, I don't actually teach content, social studies, English, but what I do find that it still allows me to do is I do a lot of our trainings and feel I can still feel that teaching passion with helping educators and families learn more about learning differences so that they can use the strategies in their teaching and their parenting. So that's sort of how it all went about.
Absolutely. I love that story. And I love how you even though you're not teaching and that's not your role, you continue to do that, as you're helping strategies, because you're teaching strategies, right? You're teaching strategies that are helpful. And, we talked about the fact that this is the end of the school year. We're recording this at the end of the school year. Things are wrapping up. And, oftentimes it's panic time
Yes.
for students and maybe even for parents.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things coming up for students. And are there key strategies that parents can use during this time to help their kids, their teens stay motivated and engaged?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Because you're right, it is panic time. It's end of the year, and it also makes it even more complex. That even for like sports seasons, like that's also like wrapping up. So it's also like pretty crucial times in like the baseball season or basketball, and with your academics. So there really is a lot. And I think it depends on like the age of the child that you're working with. I think with elementary school, maybe there isn't as much of a big focus on like final exams, although there might be like ERBs. I know that those sort of maybe have just happened. But I think with elementary school students, generally having the parents, the onus will be a little bit more on the parents to put together the structure for the kids. I think being able to say, if this is going to be a pretty busy season, how are we in our home with our family plans catering to the fact that this might be a bit of a more stressful season? There might be more projects or more like state testing going on. What does it look like? Our daughter is doing, she's a third grader, she's doing some state testing. So we're thinking about making sure we're sleeping early. We're not doing too many things that are like late in the evening. And I think for middle and high schoolers, particularly with learning differences, I think understanding the way the learning differences impact the students is helpful to guide each particular student with what they might need. And I think a lot of it is parents taking on a little bit more awareness of if it's executive functioning struggles that my child has because of ADHD, then what does it look like as a parent, just in healthy ways that are welcome, to try and help with some of that. It's to say, you need to put in like an hour of work tonight. I know that's going to be a lot. How about you and I both like sit at the dining table together and we both work? I've got an hour that I need to put together to get this presentation ready. You can do that. We can encourage each other. So ways in which it's noticing what is the learning difference and how is that impacting the student's work. And as a parent, how do I come alongside? It could also be having a tutor, having an executive functioning coach, having a content tutor come in. But I think it would depend on the student, the grade level that they're in, and how to support in ways that are welcome and aren't overwhelming.
Right. And it just seems like that additional support may be particularly helpful for students who, again, have a number of demands coming at them at this particular time, and they're trying to navigate all of these things. You mentioned like projects, end of year projects and book reports and papers and, presentations that they need to give. They may all be coming to a head at the same time. And then they also want to, prepare for end of year, activities. Maybe there's end of year parties or get-togethers, and the weather's getting nice depending on where you are. And there might be, students want to get together and maybe even have culminating activities for their sports organizations and teams and things like that. So they're pulled in a number of different directions.
Yes.
And they want to do everything.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I think that is one key just realization. I love how you like sort of laid it all out of how many things could be on the table and the desire to do everything. And I think even some of the conversations that parents can have with their kids is, sure, you have this particular like huge game or this huge tournament this weekend, and you have this your dress rehearsal for this play that you're in, and there's this party happening on Saturday, and you have a pretty big test next Wednesday. So having sitting down with your child, and oftentimes with learning differences, the ability to sort of forecast into the future and see how much time do I have? How do I prioritize something that's next week when there's other things right now which seem more important and exciting? How do we look and say, okay, how much time do you realistically have? How are we going to manage our time in these ways? once you get home on Wednesday, let's remember that you need to get this much work done because of that. So I think helping that process of giving the students the tools to see the bigger picture of you want to do all these things, these are all important to you, that's great. We can't forget this thing happening next Thursday. Let's be mindful about how we're spending our time and how can I come alongside you to help you focus in the time that you have to make sure you're able to do all these without getting too overwhelmed.
Right. And that's really important. Again, that not getting overwhelmed, because that's so easy to do when you have a number of things on your plate and when you're excited about, a number of the different things that are coming up. And I love that you've identified, some common challenges for students with learning differences. You mentioned executive functioning and time management. And so maybe students have been working with a schedule during the academic year, but now there are additional things that weren't on the calendar before that are now coming up. And when you talk about executive functioning, I think about, prioritizing, how important that is. How do you help students kind of navigate the executive functioning challenges that might impact them, particularly as the school year wraps up?
Yeah, that's really good. And particularly with students with learning differences, I think what we see is that some of these challenges are present in the neurotypical population. They're just heightened if you have a learning difference. So, time management and time blindness, for example, is one that we all have. We're all time blind. We all prioritize our present selves over our future selves. But it's just heightened if you have a learning difference often. And so that's one aspect where helping students manage their time and look at what's coming up and decide on let's actually make a schedule. If you have a learning difference, you oftentimes aren't naturally drawn to using a calendar because your brain doesn't see time in that exact way. So it could be depending on how impacted the ability to use a calendar is, it might be that as a parent, you're saying, I will put a calendar together for you. Like I will put a few things in the calendar. And each time when we get home, I'll take some time out of my day to sit with you and look over your calendar and say, okay, so how much time do you have? Remember, you need to be in bed by 8:30 because you have an earlier day tomorrow. So we really only have this much time. So what homework do you have? Let's prioritize that. So doing some of that executive functioning coaching, and it's going to depend on how far along your child is. It might be that they're pretty strong with executive functioning skills, or they might be a little bit weak. And depending on where they are, it might need more modeling from a parent or an executive functioning coach. Something else that comes alongside with executive functioning weakness is metacognition, or the ability to think about how you're doing or to evaluate your systems and say, the way that I'm studying, is that serving me? If you have executive functioning challenges, then you don't naturally look back and review how you're doing. And the way that plays out with academics is maybe you get a test back. You aren't naturally drawn to look at where you went wrong and learn from that. Or you got an essay back. You're not naturally drawn to looking at those corrections. So that's another way in which a parent and executive functioning coach can help with thinking about more efficient study strategies. So you have a social studies test coming up. Let's look at your past test and let's look at areas where maybe you didn't do as well as you assumed that you're going to do. Let's look at how you're studying. Are you just reading the textbook chapter start to front? That might work, but that might be time consuming. It might be if you're going to read through it, are we going to draw a timeline? Is that a way for you to remember some of this a little bit more easily? So I think noting some of those challenges with time blindness, with metacognition, those can really help with helping a student move forward with how they are looking at this final stretch.
Right. And there's so much interaction between those things that you described, the metacognition and the time blindness. And I think about students who underestimate, when you talk about the time blindness, underestimate how much time they're going to need.
That's good.
And so that's where an executive functioning coach can be helpful, because they can look at this calendar and say, you have the social studies test. I see that you've allotted an hour for this. But remember, when you took the midterm exam, that you didn't do as well as you expected, and we may want to dedicate some more time this time around. And let's look at where else in your calendar we can carve out some time to do this. And then not only the time, but it sounds like needing a strategy for how are we going to use this time so it will be beneficial for you, right?
Yeah, that's so well put. And I think, yeah, the idea there is like a wonderful but sometimes misguided optimism of, yes, I have this test on Wednesday, but I have 4 hours on Monday and I'm going to study for all 4 hours and I'm going to get everything done. And then I don't need any time on Tuesday, so I can go for this party on Tuesday. Um, I think that optimism of, and that comes again from, this is a difficulty of looking back in the metacognition of saying, how did that work for me last time? And how is that coming to place? And I love how you talked about the idea of prioritizing our time, and being strategy focused, because that's another area that is oftentimes challenging if you have a learning difference, is to operate from a foundation of a plan and saying, okay, I have this time, I already know how I'm going to spend this time, versus oftentimes, particularly for ADHD, how the ADHD brain works, it's very much what's happening right now. Like I'm very focused on the now. It's very hard for me to think about the future. So it's more impulsive versus more strategy and goal driven. And any way that we can sort of move our students to be a little bit more strategy driven with a big project like final exams, I think that's generally going to serve them well.
Absolutely. And I think that's just kind of the brilliance of the work that you do, with working with students who have these executive functioning challenges or other learning differences, is that you help them with the strategy, right? You talk about being strategy focused and help with planning, because they can put that hour or those 4 hours on the calendar. But then when they sit down, as you know, they have problems with task initiation. And so, 30 minutes will go by before they may even put, type a word on the document or put a pencil to the paper. If a student is easily distracted, then they've got their phone open and they've got some notifications and they're responding to some text. And then 45 minutes have gone by. Now they only have
Yes.
15 minutes to study for the social studies test, because then they got to transition to baseball practice or whatever it might be. And so that's where I think that getting that support is so helpful, because you help them with strategizing, like you said, a strategy focused approach, and to plan, how are we going to use this time, right? And part of the planning means turning off your notifications.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And I think to that point of why a strategy focused system is helpful is, some of the sort of the cyclical aspects of learning differences that actually make task initiation harder is if you don't have a calendar, for example. So you don't have a way that you're strategically planning your time. You don't have a task list to prioritize your time. Then what you are doing is you're trying to hold everything in your working memory, which is really meant for like short-term information processing. But now you are overloading your working memory with, I don't need to write down when this test is. I'm just going to remember it. Or I'm not going to try and prioritize my work in advance. I'm going to do it on the fly when I do have some extra time. And I think that adds to that overwhelm. So you have so many things that you're trying to juggle in your mind. And now, as you mentioned, or now there's end of year parties and there's extra projects, and you need to submit a group project, which requires like multiple communication touch points. And one of the key features of learning differences, one of the key characteristics, I'd say, is there's a difficulty with regulation. So regulating your emotions or managing your emotions. And if you feel overwhelmed, you get anxious, if you're able to regulate your emotions in a healthy way, then that anxiety can somehow lead to you actually executing on a task. But if you're unable to regulate those emotions, then the anxiety leads to more overwhelm, which then leads to procrastination. So you have this mounting work, and instead of being sort of pushed to start working to it because of all these things that are due, you tend to see procrastination more, or putting things off more. And I think that's where there's so many parts of it, which one, yes, we can support the executive functioning, we can support with this. But I think from a parent side, acknowledging that this is going to be really difficult, and considering how you are presenting the pressure of like, this is the final exam, you have a B, we need to get that to an A, so you really need to put in extra work. Like that's something else that's now overloading the working memory of saying, now there's a parental pressure that I really need to ace this exam. So I think even compassion and understanding and even saying, I know this is probably going to be difficult. This is an overwhelming time. Sharing some examples of, as a parent, I say this to my daughter quite a few times that she's feeling anxious. I'm like, well, I have to go to a podcast and many people might listen to a podcast. I'm a little bit anxious about it. So I need to think about how I'm preparing for it and, taking some time to look over some questions and think about my responses. So sort of coming alongside, not just with strategies and support, but also with the idea of like, I know this is hard. It's not going to be the end of the world if your B doesn't change into an A. Like, give it our best shot. I think there's a way in which that relieves some of that pressure and allows students to be more open and welcome to support.
Right. And I think that's a really good point for parents to kind of keep in mind, is that they can alleviate some of the pressure of this time in a number of different ways. One is, getting external support for executive functioning or other support that might need with reading, et cetera. And I love what you said about validation and then also compassion. So validating, yes, this is a difficult time. This is challenging. There's a lot going on for you. And then having compassion. And maybe one of the compassionate things parents can do is kind of step back from some of the chores just for a couple weeks and say, I know you have an exam. Don't worry about the dishes. I'll take care of it. And that can alleviate some of the not that they're not never going to do dishes, but maybe for this period of time, you step back from some of the chores that they would normally have to do.
That's a really, really good point. And there is just an understanding that, this is a busy time. And what can I do to support you in this? I think that's such a good point. Yeah.
Right. And even when you think about the compassionate aspect of it, it sounds like it's a really good time to also just celebrate how far they've come. This is the end of the academic year. It's, there's a lot going on, but look how far you've come, particularly for kids and students who have these learning differences. At the beginning of the year, reading was really tough for you, but you finished this entire, chapter book that you thought was going to be so daunting, or, science was a real challenge for you. And, you've developed these really great strategies for studying for this particular subject. And so it sounds like it's a really good time to celebrate those wins.
Yeah, and that's so well put, because that's the situation that we're seeing with some of our students, where there's almost like a downward spiral, like this is really hard and I haven't done any of my homework and like I've got these grades. And so for this one particular student, when our executive functioning coach has, looked at their work, it's like, actually your grades are better than you think that they are. You've actually done more homework than you assume. But it is very easy to go into a downward spiral of, this is making me very anxious and I haven't done this and I don't think my teacher's happy with me because of my grades and my parents did this. So, what you're reflecting back of, look at how far you've come, is a really positive metacognitive tool as well, to say, you had finals last year and you felt really, really, really stressed and you did a really good job. You put in your best effort and look at what happened. Same thing now, like helping them get out of the doom and gloom phase of this like final season and say, first of all, you've already done such a great job and don't forget that part of your year. So that's really helpful.
Right. And then, they have something to look forward to. Summer's right around the corner, right? And their accomplishment is they've completed this academic year, and summer is, like I said, right around the corner. And, as I think about summer, it's really interesting time because, we see summer break as a time for relaxation, to spend time with friends, to go on vacations, to take a break from school. But for some, it may present as an opportunity for learning and development that is needed. How do parents decide whether to use summer? Now, I never say use the whole summer because I don't think that's helpful, but to use some of that time for academic catch up. Like, what things should they consider when they're trying to decide, is this a good time to do some intense, phonological processing work on reading? Is this a good time to do an executive functioning group? What things should they be thinking about?
I think having a lead up that's as long as possible for the summer will be helpful. And part of building the self awareness with our students. So, for example, working with your student, realizing, yeah, I know this reading task or this book report that you have to do is pretty tough because of how much you have to read. And it's really hard for you to read through this. So, number one, yes, let's get you some help in the school year, or let me help you with this. And let's think about how to do this book report. But the more that we're able to help our students see that some of the struggles I might be having with whether it's phonological processing, whether it's reading comprehension, whether it's math, is impacting and causing me some overwhelm with the tasks that I need to complete. I think that allows it to be more of a collaborative. How about we use the summer? Some of the summer, like you said, not all of the summer, some of the summer to work on some of these tasks so that it doesn't feel as heavy next year. So, for example, if it is reading comprehension, and there are many different ways it can happen. So, either you might be as a parent doing that with your child, and it might be that we have the reading list for next year. So, how about we read through this book even before the year is? Let's watch the movie about this particular book if it's something that's literature based. Or if it's more of an intensive reading support, how about we see if we can get your tutor? We can work for some few weeks in the summer, maybe right before school starts, so that you can feel like it's a ramp up and you can feel a little bit more confident when you go in. I think those considerations of tying in a particular academic struggle student might be having to some of the overwhelm that they're feeling, especially around final season, and say, what do you think about using your summer and the time that you have available? Of course, still doing fun things, still enjoying time with family, really having a rest, but also making sure that we're using that time in a way that reduces some of the overwhelm that they might be feeling in the next school year.
Right. And then particularly when you're observing the overwhelm as the academic year wraps up, right? Like,
Yes.
what can we do to make sure things go a little more smoothly next year? And you mentioned, maybe you have the reading list for the next academic year. And if you have a child who struggles with reading, your comment about pre-reading that book or watching the movie can be so helpful and help that child feel more confident when they begin that academic year, because they can participate in the discussion about the book and they're familiar with it. And so they're actually going to be reading it for the second time when the academic year starts, which can be incredibly helpful for a number of students. And one of the ways to decrease overwhelm is to help with preparation, for preparation, because we know as the academic demands increase, so do the executive functioning demands for students. And, a student may, when I think about, for example, the transition from elementary to middle school, where they may have had one teacher, or even middle school to high school, they've had one teacher in one classroom, maybe two teachers, and now they're going to be shifting from one class to another, multiple teachers. It's going to require a lot more executive functioning. How can we provide support to prepare students for that transition?
Yeah. That's really good. And something that I'll say to that as well, because there's also the lens in which like the parent can have of seeing, I want next year to maybe not feel as difficult and not feel as overwhelming. And I think the lens that a student has, especially a student with learning differences, how far, so just like with time blindness that impacts how far into the future you can look, some of the research around the way dopamine impacts motivation has been interesting to show that more longer term motivators are a little bit more difficult to to help, in the moment task execution. So, such a weird way that I said that. But for example, as a parent, if you say to a child, really need to do well in these particular finals because, next year we're going to be applying for your middle school or your high school. We want you to get into a good high school. Or you're in high school, you really need to ace this because we're thinking about, you want you to get into a really good college. Like all those make sense. And those will be important factors for an individual with learning differences. But the shorter the motivation can be, the better. So a good college and a stable job, like all those are helpful and important, but they aren't very efficient in helping with, okay, I've got some time now and I need to work. So something that's a little bit shorter. So even if it's for example, after my daughter, for example, so again, she's a third grader, but she loves watching Bluey with me. And Blue is just a great show, so I love it as well. But she's so motivated by that if I were to say to her, yeah, I'm going to put your younger brothers to bed and your bedtime is 8:15. So if you can get your work done after I put your brothers to bed, then we can definitely get some time to watch Blue. It's that motivator is just so much closer in time. That's going to be more helpful to get her going and say, okay, great, let me focus. I'm going to get this, I'm going to put in my 30 minutes. I'm going to work on here. And so the more that you can do that with your child, even if it's to say, I know this is a hard week on Friday, let's do something fun. That's probably going to be a more efficient motivator to get the task initiation happening versus, 5 weeks down the line, we're going to do something fun for summer, which is great. And that's going to be a great motivator. And they're going to look forward to that. But it's going to be harder to sort of bring that into the present and say, how do I put away my phone? How do I make sure I'm getting this time as efficiently worked as possible?
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense because again, the short-term reward is more meaningful to them, right? It's much more of a motivator to, again, I'm going to watch Bluey in an hour.
Yeah, so exactly.
An hour I understand. This is or before bed, right?
Yes,
and so
yes.
I'm going to work as hard as I can because I know that I will have this time before bedtime. And I completely get that. My son is in 4th grade. Right now he's all about the NBA finals. And if you can watch part of it, because I'm not going to watch the whole thing on a school night, but part of that game, it's like, okay, you sit here and prepare for your social studies test. And after you're done, I will watch part of the NBA finals with you. And that's all the motivation.
Yeah.
He needs.
That's great. I love it. Yeah.
I love that example because if I say at the end of the school year, think how good you'll feel having done well in social studies, that's not going to have the same impact.
Right. 100%. You'll know all about American history and you're going to be so...
Yes. Think how much more you'll know. Isn't that great motivator? No, not necessarily.
Yeah.
Right.
That's great. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that's an important thing that parents can use to motivate, especially, their students are tired. It's been a long academic year. They've been working so hard, and students with learning challenges have to work so much harder than their peers. And so they're exhausted at the end of the year. So how can we, alleviate some of that, again, that overwhelm and that fatigue? You're right at the end of the finish line. What can we do to get you through this period? Again, it sounds like you're saying, help them, provide as much support that is needed, give them some grace, show compassion for them, provide the type of support that would be helpful for them at this particular time. And then if needed, use some of that summer time for catch up. But again, like we said, not the whole summer, but definitely use it in a way that makes them feel more confident going into the next academic year.
I think that's extremely helpful, thinking about all of those pieces of this high pressure situation, and then the summer, which allows for more time to be proactive with that. But like you said, the grace and compassion, understanding, support, I think that will go a really, really long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And even as, maybe the plan wasn't to spend, some time working on executive functioning or reading over the summer, but you're noticing at the end of the school year that things were really tough, right? Or there hasn't been as much progress. Then, like you're saying, if students are struggling with that metacognition, the end of the year, it's a good time to reflect, on things that went really well and helping the student. You talked about being collaborative. What went well and what are areas where you still need to work on, and then deciding on how to use some time during the summer or just before the next year starts, or having a plan in place for the next academic year where maybe it's a good time to make sure that you have some executive functioning support for the next academic year. Let's get that in place now so that you'll have that support, because we know, again, that things are going to be changing in middle school and high school, and these skills are going to be incredibly important. We want to make sure that you start the academic year strong.
And in terms of some of the ways that, or some of the tools and resources that we use in the summer, there are some self-paced tools which, I think are amazing. So, something like IXL, which I think a lot of parents know about because a lot of it is used in schools where, you can select third grade math, for example, fourth grade math, or middle school math. And it's a self-paced course. So if you take an assessment, and each day you can do a little bit of work on that. It gives you like a worked example. The same thing with Alex Math, which is really good in that same way as well. You do an assessment, it identifies some of the areas that you need to work on, and then you can do that. So for math, there are quite a few self-paced options, and those programs are fantastic. I think one thing to consider with using a self-paced resource is how much accountability or structure your student might need. And if they have a learning difference, it might be challenging to say, you need to make sure you find some time in your day to get 15 minutes of this IXL work every day. As a parent, if you can be like, I'll sit down with you for those 15 minutes, that's great. That's perfect structure. That's perfect accountability. But those are excellent resources, but it does require a fair amount of structure and accountability. I think if you were to consider maybe having a tutor or having an educator, an ed therapist work with your child, it might be in situations where it might need to be more intensive. So if it's foundational remedial reading support that's needed, a few times a week, then that would be helpful to have someone in place and say, let's have a tutor either come to the house or we'll go somewhere and work on these skills a couple of times each week. That's going to be a little bit harder to do self-paced because it really needs somebody, that clinical eye, to see, okay, where are the gaps? How are we doing? And we have had families also ask about executive functioning support in the summer, which I think could be a good idea, but a potential drawback of executive functioning in the summer is that executive functioning skills are best built when there is current work to prioritize, when there's projects and assignments and tests, which the summer doesn't usually lend itself to. But there are options of saying, one thing I really wish I did. I love art. I love fine art and drawing. And I feel like throughout my life, I've never taken the time to really put in the work to make that skill more than what it is right now. I feel like I'd always wanted to improve that, but I think that also requires, some time that's somewhat uninterrupted, a little bit more flexible time and some accountability. And I think if there are some passion projects that need to be done, or if there's a reading list and we want to read this book and we want to work on some questions on this book, if there is current work to be done on passion projects, then I think executive functioning could be good to work on in sort of the summer as well.
Right. And I really like the passion project idea because, again, if students have been, during the academic year focusing so much on their academics and they were in need of additional support and they've spent all their afternoons in speech therapy or OT or, educational therapy, it's a great time to kind of lean into their talents and spend some time developing those. You mentioned, maybe you're in a play or maybe you're going to play in a summer league for a sport that you're interested in. It's a great time to do those things.
Yeah. We have some high schoolers who were, part of their summer projects that they do with an executive functioning coach, or seniors in high school were, get a driver's license and apply for a job and get some of those pieces that require a fair amount of planning and strategy and goal setting and setting time aside. Those also could be helpful things as well to think about. Would I need some support and accountability to get this done in the summer? Because if I do it myself, I might not actually get it done.
Right. And I think that accountability is a great time for that, to get some check-ins and to get some support. This has been so helpful. This is going to be this, and like I said, it's a stressful time for students often, and oftentimes for parents, it's stressful as well, right? Because they are, kind of filling in the gap and trying to provide support and wanting their kids to do well and to end the school year on a high note. And so I really appreciate all the work that you do in supporting learners. If our listeners want to get in touch with you and connect with you, if they need additional support for their child, their teen, as the academic year wraps up, or during the summer months, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So on our website, so if you go to haytoneducation.com, there'll be a contact us link there. And if you were to submit your details, we get that information that same day. And one of us as directors would reach out and find out what the needs are, what your available times are, how we can support. So our tutors are often able to come to the house and help with in-person or virtual sessions as needed. So that's one way to contact us. If you want to contact me directly, my email address is Hunja, that's HUNJA, at haytoneducation.com. But yeah, easiest if that was too much to follow, just the Hayton Education website and this with the contact us page, and then we'll get back to you.
Wonderful. And I will be sure to put all of that information in the show notes so that individuals can reach out to you and to the Hayton team, to connect with someone who can really support their learners. So thank you again so much for being here, and can't wait till our next collaboration.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me today. Be sure to go to the show notes to learn more about Hunja and Hayton education. The final weeks of school can have a huge influence on how your child feels about learning, schooling, and future teachers. So be sure to check out the show notes to grab your free checklist with strategies to help your child have a successful end of school year and a strong start to the next. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.